Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking geopolitics with the political economist, writer, and commentator Helen Thompson. There is a lot of geopolitics about, you may have noticed, from Greenland to Venezuela, from Taiwan to Ukraine. And we are going to be talking about how unlikely, how unusual, how weird it is to live in a world so dominated by the United States. Where does American power come from? What makes it so distinctive? And what is the direction of travel? Helen, when people talk about the United States as an exceptional nation, American power is exceptional, it's always a value judgment of some kind or another. American exceptionalism is an argument about, is America special? Is it different because it instantiates certain values? Is it exceptionally wicked? There are definitely some people who think that the United States is an exceptionally wicked nation. This is not that conversation. I want to say that up front. But we are going to be talking about what makes American power different, what makes it unusual, what makes it outside of the norm in the broad sweep of history. There is something very distinctive about living in a world in which the dominant power is the United States, and this is partly a question of geography, is where the United States is. So I just want to start with that basic question. What do you think is unusual outside of the norm about a world in which the dominant power is in the Western Hemisphere and is essentially an ocean away, depending which way you go, 2 oceans away, from what is traditionally the center of global power, the Eurasian landmass, let's call it that?
I think the fundamental thing is that it's not just that it's been traditionally the center of power in the world. It was for the entirety of world history until the rise of the United States as a geopolitical power, the center. Now, I don't think that means, in fact, I don't think this at all, that the Western Hemisphere doesn't matter in world history until the United States becomes a geopolitical power. I think that's a pretty erroneous reading of what happens in the 16th century. Nonetheless, I think if we think of the big picture of world history, and I know this is a massive oversimplification, but it will do for the moment, of the rise and fall of empires, then that story had taken place primarily, because Africa is something of a complication, but primarily in Eurasia. Now, something had already changed by the time that the United States became the dominant power, and that was that the previous dominant power wasn't actually on the Eurasian landmass itself. It was Britain, offshore of the Eurasian landmass. So we've got something about maritime power offshore of Eurasia coming into play before we get to the United States. But nonetheless, I think that the significance is such of the United States being able to dominate geopolitically without being in Eurasia, or on Eurasia, I should say, or an island off it, that it is a fundamental juncture or conjuncture in world history. And I think there's something else that kind of gets at that. I mean, it's coming at it in a completely different way, but I think it kind of gets at the same point. If you think of the world's major religions, the 4 largest religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, they all come out of Eurasia and not out of the Western Hemisphere. And obviously, in the case of the first 2 of those, they are dependent, or they have their origins, I should say, in Judaism. So if you looked at it that way, if you looked at world history religiously instead of world history geopolitically, and then you would also say that something prior to the United States locates the engine of world history in Eurasia. And this time, and this I think is of some significance, including perhaps to the present moment, is that the United States is actually dependent upon the culture that was formed in Eurasia, and not in a religious culture sense, or the deepest sense of culture, not on one that came out of the Americas themselves. So I think it's both a fundamental turn in world history because it leaves Eurasia behind geopolitically. Again, that oversimplifies, but you get the gist. But at the same time, the United States in particular does not escape its cultural connection, its cultural origins in Eurasia. And that, I think, is part of the complicated moment that we're now in.
So we're going to get to the moment that we're now in, but there is a long story there. As you said, you're not arguing, no one would argue that the Americas didn't matter until the United States drew everyone's attention westwards or eastwards, depending on which way you're looking. But if you, say, take a point in time like towards the end of the 17th century, so you suggested in the 16th century, for the growth of the Spanish Empire, the Americas are absolutely central. And the resources that can be extracted from the Americas are absolutely central to that story. So it's not as if it's not a part of grand power politics on the geopolitical stage. But at the end of the 17th century, to suggest that quite soon in the broad sweep of history, the North American continent, a continental state in North America, would be the dominant, not just a dominant, but the dominant global power. I mean, I realize it's an impossible question to answer. Imagine yourself a 17th century somebody. You could be Chinese, you could be Dutch, you could be French, you could be Spanish. You could be looking at this from Africa. But just how improbable do you think that would be? Or at least how much of an imaginative stretch would it require for someone at the end of the 17th century to think, not just we're going to be fighting over this, but this is where power is going to relocate. It's going to become a centrifugal force in global politics. It feels to me like that would require a very big imaginative leap. Obviously, for us, it's a background fact. We don't need to make an imaginative leap. Almost for us, the imaginative leap is to do the other thing and to remind ourselves how weird it is. But if you go back just a few centuries, do you think it would have seemed, I'm trying to think of a word, outlandish as an idea?
I do, actually, because, I mean, and this is where we get into an immediate difficulty, is what do we mean when we say the United States at the end of the 17th century? Because it doesn't exist. Even if we just take it to be the British colonies that become the future first 13 states of the United States, just on the eastern seaboard. I think even that is a complete stretch, because it's, I think, impossible to think that the United States could have become the kind of geopolitical power that it became without it first becoming a continental state. So in order to get from that end of the 17th century to the end of the 19th century, where we can put the origins of the United States' rise as a geopolitical power, you've got to get through not only the British colonies declaring their independence from the British Crown, you've got to get through expelling the French and the Spanish and the Dutch out of the future of the United States. You've got to get through the destruction of the Native American population all the way to the Pacific. And you've got to get through the ability, in terms of transportation, to join up the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts. And you've got to get through the shrinking of Mexico. Well, a Spanish Mexico at that point, so I suppose you could put that down. But even then, you can't just say that translates from the expulsion of the Spanish into the United States taking Mexico, because that requires the United States itself to fight a war with Mexico in 1848. So the words United States just would not, even if you sort of projected them into the 13 colonies, they just couldn't capture the transformation that's got to take place for that to happen.
And of course, framing it in those terms makes it sound, to go back to that other way of having this conversation, like it's a kind of destiny. There's something exceptional going on here. This is just a remarkable story. And in many ways, it is a remarkable story. But that doesn't get away from the fact that just in geographical terms, geopolitical terms, there's something improbable and unusual going on here. And one of the questions telling someone at the end of the 17th century, even through the 18th century, what's going to happen, they would presumably think that the puzzle is the one that you alluded to, which is, if this place is going to become a real center of power, is it because it's going to somehow drag the rest of the world into its orbit? Or is the only way that this is going to work, given just how remote in various ways it is from the traditional centers of power and indeed the traditional centers of the most important resources, it's going to have to go way beyond just being a continental state and almost by definition having to be a kind of global political entity. Do you think projecting forward, it would seem like there's at least a puzzle here. This can't just be a story of continental conquest, because we are still a long way from the places that have traditionally, and through the 19th century and the 20th century, do still matter. This state is going to have to be unusual in the extent to which it projects outside of its natural sphere of influence. This isn't going to be a state that becomes a global power because of its relationships with Canada and Mexico. It's going to have to do something that is different in the way it projects power.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another aspect to this, which in a way you've just alluded to, which is if we try to put ourselves into this end of the 17th century mindset and we're looking at the whole Americas, and you were told that somewhere in the Americas was going to, in 2 centuries' time, be the dominant geopolitical power, or was on the cusp of being the dominant geopolitical power in the world, I don't think you would choose those 13 colonies of Britain's, or England's as they then were actually, on the eastern seaboard. You would choose, I think, Spanish Mexico, and imagine that the Spanish had been booted out of that. And I think you would do that because the most important resource, and you could say the most important resource in the entire world at that time, were the silver mines in the Spanish Empire. So actually in present-day Mexico and present-day, first of all, Bolivia and then Mexico. So if you were thinking in those terms and you thought resources made power, you would not think that those 13 colonies could be a geopolitical power, even if you were given some information, I think, because they were not the place where there were the world's most important resources. So I think that adds another level of weirdness, if we were to use your weirdness to the thing. If we start from there, yeah, if that is what our starting place is, because if you just had a kind of resources equal power mindset and you could imagine the reaction against European empire, which I don't think is too difficult to imagine, that the European powers would be booted out of the Americas, then the victor, so to speak, of that, I think you would locate that much further south than the northeast seaboard.
What about the other resources? So the Eurasian landmass is a center of many things, including, it was traditionally believed, food production, but also various other kinds of energy sources that would need to power whatever global powers were going to dominate. You tell these people at the end of the 17th century, you are going to get a continental conquest of this landmass, this North American landmass. It's not going to extend all the way up into Canada. It's going to shrink Mexico. It's not going to take over the whole of Mexico, but it's going to expand north and south, and it's going to, most importantly, expand west. Do you think the assumption there would be, okay, the way this is going to work is actually this is now going to be a global hub for food production? That might be the resource story that we're talking about here. Or do you think the thought would be, and this would relate to the story about the rise of Great Britain, actually for this to work, the other thing that's going to have to change is the way that maritime power operates. This is a nation that is cut off by two oceans, essentially. If it's not going to be built on trade with Canada and Mexico, which are its two possible trading partners, without there being an ocean in the way, there is going to have to be some transformation in the ways in which sea power and transportation across the seas happens, because otherwise this place just looks too far away. I mean, it still is far away. In some ways it hasn't changed. Air travel hasn't got any quicker. The United States is still a long way. It's not Australia, but it's still a long way from most of the places where most of the stuff happens in the world. So do you think, I'm giving you two possibilities here, but one of which is the scale of this continental enterprise is sufficient that it could in some ways become, in its own landmass, a real power hub, or actually something more would have to happen as well?
Yeah, on the first one, on the land question, I think that you could imagine something here, even at that point, perhaps. If you build into that the taking of the land from the Native Americans, because a significant part of that land, particularly either side of the Mississippi, is astonishingly fertile land. And because of the nature of human life on North America to that point, had not been used for agricultural production in anything like the way that the lands of Eurasia had been used. So if you just put it in a very simple sense, these are like new lands They're not new lands in the sense that they're not being lived upon, but they're new lands in terms of the kind of agriculture that had been seen in Eurasia to that point. I mean, there is some agriculture in those lands, but not in the way that's been done in Eurasia. So I think you could imagine a land conquest, if you like, by the eastern seaboard settlements that would give that expanding state a opportunity that is not available in Eurasia. I mean, when the Russians are expanding eastwards to the Pacific, they are not taking in anything like the fertility of that of land in the same way, not least because part of it is a steppe. So that I think is imaginable. I think that the trade question, though, is more complex. I mean, I don't think I would say that even at that point, even in the 16th century, that the Americas are isolated by trade. Indeed, I would say that if you go further south, which is obviously the center of gravity in the 16th and the 17th century in terms of the Americas' integration into the world economy, that's been in some ways created, I would say, by Spanish and Portuguese conquests in the Americas. You can see, if you just take the silver that's coming out of those mines, in present-day Bolivia and later Mexico, it is going across the Atlantic and it is going across the Pacific. And a lot of it is ending up both ways, actually, in China. So if you then look on the Pacific side and you look at the development of Manila, as a city, it's essentially a port that's created out of that silver trade in its original form. So I think I would say that you can actually see at that point, even though it's not really concentrated in North America, it's all about the Potosi mines in Mexico, how a power in the Americas one day would be what we would now say global trading power that's going across both oceans. Now, obviously, it's going to be a lot easier to do that once you've got steamships rather than sail ships. The hazards of it are going to be considerably less. But I still think that you can see the essential pattern, if you like, of global trade around the Americas in that moment from the point in which the silver trade takes off in the way in which it does.
And what do you think would be envisaged as the vulnerabilities of this new entity? So what would it need to import? Where would its dependencies be? Again, I mean, I realize that I'm putting a lot on this imagined sort of looking forward perspective, but given the unusual nature of American power and people having to imagine a world which is the world that we now live in. I mean, it is just a brute fact that the American century was the American century. It may be coming to an end, it may not. We're going to get onto that. But in the American century, the fact of American power is not something that anyone could argue with. But before it exists, what do you think would be seen as the vulnerabilities? We know in a way some of the invulnerabilities. This is not Europe. This place is not going to be easy to invade. This place is not going to be part of the kind of near European civil wars that shape centuries and centuries of global power conflicts. But what would its vulnerabilities be, do you think?
Well, I think that this gets back to the complication of the fact that we can't compare what exists at that time with what the United States will become. Because by the time it's a continental state, by the 1890s, it's incorporated into its territory via the war with Mexico, all that gold that is the center of the gold rush in California. And that's probably an important part of the expansion into a continental state story in itself. So you are looking at the end of the 17th century, a metal poor, fertile land, possibility of westward expansion into even more fertile, much more actually fertile land. So I think you could imagine a story in which if you were told that actually, there was gold in the southwest of this future country, and that there would be the creation of a United States that was sufficiently military developed to take that territory through a war with Mexico, you can imagine that this continental state could be successful. I mean, you're leaving the energy question out of that, but I think we can park that for a moment. I think one of the things that is interesting, though, that before this point, so from the 1850s, is there is something that is identified as a resource vulnerability for this United States. So before it's got to the Pacific, which is guano, which is essentially a like seabird excrement that's being used as a fertilizer because it's nitrogen rich. The British become obsessed by it in the 1840s. It's only at that point being produced in Peru. And so I think it's not unreasonable to say that the first bit of the US intent of expansion outside the continental states, so into offshore, is this act that's passed in 1856, which essentially says that any US citizen who takes possession of an uninhabited island where there is guano can do so in the name of the United States. And there are 10 of these islands that are actually still part of the United States as unincorporated territories to this day. So I think that's the point where you can say, look, this state that is coming into being, it's not there yet in the 1850s, but there are people who've got obviously a very strong sense of manifest destiny by this point, thinks that actually the United States, even with all the abundant resources, it is clear by this point that the US possesses, including the gold, that it's still not a resource self-sufficient entity. And that is part of the explanation as to why the United States will engage in expansion beyond the landmass. I mean, it's not the only explanation, but it's interesting that it's not a kind of resource dependency that's usually thought of.
But does that mean that the ideal of self-sufficiency, which is part of what might be thought to lie behind the power of a continental state, certainly relative to the previous global power, Great Britain, no one at any point is going to think that this power could be based on self-sufficiency. But in the case of the United States, there have been points, including in the 20th century, where an idea of self-sufficiency is what animates notions of American power. But the story you just told suggests it's always an illusion in the sense that the precondition of self-sufficiency is to be a continental state. But even before the United States becomes a continental state, it's reached the limits of the ideal of self-sufficiency because it's living in a world of sufficient complexity and technological competition that it's going to need resources from outside its own landmass.
Yeah, and it goes back to the fact that actually one of its, some might say its biggest asset, that's point, which is the fertility of the land of what we now think of as Middle America. Actually, already there's a quite urgent need for fertilizers in order to make that land as productive as the farmers want it to be. And that sense is that if you think about that moment, because Britain, as I say, has been importing tons of this stuff from Peru from the 1840s, is that the United States and Britain and other European countries, I mean, this is going to be a very important story for Germany later under the Kaiser Wilhelm, are caught up in the same resource competition. And I think I'm right in saying, it may have even been in the 1850s, is that a US naval warship actually visited one of these islands. I think it was called New Nantucket then. So you can say actually that the development of US, or the projection of US maritime power, is first evident on a resource question, and one which ties the Americans to the resource competition that's going on in Europe. And just to say, just so consequential is this issue for the Germans, essentially when they can't get any in the build-up to the First World War and when the First World War starts, is that's where you get artificial nitrogen from. Because the Germans have to, or synthetic nitrogen, whatever you want to call it, they have to find a solution to this problem. So in that sense, very early on, that this ambitious United States is caught up in resource conflicts that tie what goes on in the Americas to Eurasia.
Do you think at various points in that story, as the United States grows, an assumption would also be that the resource it lacks is people? So it is going to displace, indeed destroy, many of the native peoples of the landmass that it's going to conquer. It is not going to assimilate them. It is not going to draw on them as a resource. It treats them basically as an obstacle to be overcome with all the brutality that involves, with the result that this is a massively underpopulated continent. And geopolitics is sometimes framed in the language of demography. This is partly about population. Does this look to the rest of the world, do you think? Does it look to itself like a part of the world where without importing people, this can't work?
I think that there isn't really any way to imagine the emergence of the United States as the geopolitical power that it becomes without the migration of millions and millions of Europeans to the United States. And that's before we get onto the question of slavery in this as well. Though obviously once the Civil War is over, then there is no slavery in the United States. But that's not until 1865. And obviously until then, that was one of the things, the presence of slave labor, that would have made or did make the United States look pretty odd to many Europeans, particularly in Britain. Some might say hypocritically so. But to go back to the point about the export of labour from Europe and Western Europe in particular into the United States, you could say, well, that story of what's happening in Europe at that point and what's happening in the United States, again, tie that part of the Western Hemisphere and Eurasia back together, because in a way, European countries like Britain dealing with it, their economic and social and political problems caused by industrialization and the huge expansion of population comes with industrialization by exporting that population to the United States. And then that population is the one that is developing the lands of the United States for agricultural purposes, having destroyed the native population and the buffalo to do so. So in that sense, it's not a story of US self-sufficiency at all.
The fact that the United States is a slave state until 1865, as you say, makes it an outlier from the perspective of the middle of the 19th century. It is not an outlier in the broad sweep of dominant powers in world history. Most of the dominant powers in world history to that point were slave states. Rome was a slave state. Britain had been, at various points, a state that at least traded in slaves. So thinking about the things that make the United States unusual, maybe even unique as a global power, a dominant global power, outside of geography, because this isn't just about geography, and geopolitics isn't just the geography of politics. I want to just offer you a few and just get your sense of the ways in which some of these do make the United States an exceptional global power, not in a moral sense, but just in a historical sense. So one of which is, and we've already just touched on this, but I think it is a really important fact about the United States. It is, I think, the only dominant power that was a colony, in the sense Rome wasn't a colony. China has never really been, China is not a post-colonial society in that sense. It's had, of course, periods of being dominated. Maybe the Dutch Republic, you could say the Dutch Republic was briefly a global power. It was briefly the richest state on earth, but I don't think it lasted long enough. It was clearly a post-colonial society. It had to fight a war of colonial independence from Spain. Britain was not a colony in that sense. The United States formation is a classic post-colonial story, a war of independence from a dominant power that had colonized it, emancipation, and then a post-colonial existence. And so here we now have the state that rules the world in some respects, but shaped by its emancipation from imperial rule. Now, I don't know whether we want to say this is particularly significant or not. The United States does seem to have a somewhat schizophrenic attitude to empire. In the eyes of the rest of the world, a deeply hypocritical attitude to empire. Some of its self-defining rhetoric is anti-imperial in its formation. Do you think it shapes the kind of power that it is in the world in ways that do make it unusual, maybe even unique?
I think there is one case, at least just off the top of my head, thinking about it, where you can say it's not a parallel, and that in a sense it's not a parallel is interesting, is the Spanish case, because Spain's rise as a geopolitical power comes essentially after the end of Islamic Spain. I think on the US case, it does, though, form a very complicated take that they have on empire. Partly, I think, because into, if you like, the American national mythology, if we can call it that, there is, I think, this idea of self-assertion, national self-assertion against the British Crown. And because the British Crown was the centre of an empire at the time, that is cast then as an anti-imperial struggle. I mean, obviously what it completely ignores is the fact that the American settlers are as much part of that empire, English as it is in origin, not British, as the Crown. And so I think that when they compare themselves as a state that was forged in a struggle for national independence, it can't be the same as, say, if you say that to a Vietnamese person about the French Empire, that's where it just looks ridiculous, because the Vietnamese can't be the Americans in any telling of those two imperial stories. I think, though, that there has been a legacy of it in the sense of, at least at times, because I don't think it's there all the time, reluctance to present themselves as imperial when that is, by any historical comparison, the kind of power that they have exercised. And at times it hasn't been the case, because Philippines is taken as a colony, ruled as a colony as a result of the Spanish-American War. So it's not a complete, we will exercise power in the world in the way which is anti-imperial because that is our origins. There has at times, I think, been a willingness to accept that the United States acts as an imperial power. But there's also, I think, been, as I say, unease and this idea that somehow saying that violates an ideal of an America that's supposed to be something else.
As a child, looking at the map of the world, this is the 1970s in my case, I guess it could be any period in the 20th century pretty much. Obviously, the United States grows to 50 states even in the 20th century, but that landmass, you just look at a map of the world and I don't know if the word is natural, but it looks like, yeah, here's a large, very large state, country as I would have thought of it as a child, which is just squatting on this landmass. It goes from coast to coast. It runs from north to south to what, all borders are arbitrary, but you might say, there you go, there's Canada, there's Mexico. Here's this kind of square block in the middle. Yeah, it feels sort of natural and maybe even inevitable that there would be a country that would occupy that space. And yet, for all the reasons that we've been describing, this was a really fraught process, the acquisition of that space. Lots and lots and lots of things had to happen. Do you think there's something, again, unusual about American power in the extent to which that state is, I think, in its own self-imagining, a kind of natural entity? Here it is. This is, like all nations, by the time they become entrenched in people's imaginations, you think this, its borders are exactly where they should be, and this is who we are as a people. Yet it was very quick, it was very brutal, and it was very contingent through the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the 19th century. This expansion, it was fast, it was extremely violent, it was conquest. It wasn't just these lands fell into America's lap because somehow it was always going to be the case that this was going to be a single political entity. Is there a kind of blind spot in American power because of this? I mean, I know there's a lot of historiography and there's a lot of historical arguments about how to think about the growth of the United States, but just thinking of it as a world power relative to other world powers, do you think that 19th century story is in itself a bit of an outlier?
Yeah, I do. I think it goes back to this question of what the origin story for the United States is. And I think that the one that came to be privileged is the story of 1776 and 1787, meaning the Constitution. And then you add on to that the 19th century story symbolized by the Statue of Liberty, and essentially European migration, though it's often not really recognized that it's European migration. It's presented as a sort of more universal ideal than that, which is obviously not true. But you could argue, and I think that, I know we've talked about Cormac McCarthy before in various things we've done together, but I think that his novel Blood Meridian is very astute on this. I think in some ways it is the definitive novel about the United States, and it puts the origin story really around the Mexico War and in violence. It makes violence absolutely central to that founding of America as the continental state and not the constitutional founding in 1787. But we know that the first story has been much, much more to the fore in the language of American politics, certainly that we grew up with anyway, than the second story has. I'd say the second story is coming back into view in some sense. But I think that part of what makes, in a way, this moment in time difficult, not just for Americans or many Americans, many liberal Americans, but also in Europe, is seeing that you really do have to get to grips with what the actual 19th century story of the United States is. And I think that the story of the founding via both the nationalism or the anti-imperialism, I was going to call it that, which I just think is a bit, say, nonsensical way of thinking about it, of 1776, and then the constitutionalism of 1787, just doesn't equip anyone to see the actual history of the United States and this staggering rise of a continental state, as you say, David, over a really, really short period of time by any historical standard. And it's true, and I think this is what makes it interesting, and it's certainly what makes it different from Russia, I think, as a continental state, that conquest then was able to have some kind of cultural unification project. And I say that with some hesitation because, as we've already both said, there's a destruction underneath that. It's not a straight cultural unification project because it involves the destruction of the Native American population and the buffalo. But at the same time is that there is a successful nation building that comes for the non-Native American population. Even to some extent, I would say that can include, at least in principle, the African American population as former slaves, this sort of national identity of being Americans. And so that, I think, then adds to the singularity, weirdness of it, is that there is at least a partially successful cultural unification that goes with it over a really rather short period of time as well.
Do you think one of the things that's weird for us Europeans looking at this now, and we're going to get on to now in the second part of this conversation, but across this history, is this is a national unification project, but it's not really an indigenous culture in any sense. It's an imported culture, as you said, religion, but not just religion, the ideas. This is a European-inspired project. So we kind of feel like we see ourselves in it, and yet in many of the ways that we've been talking about, it's really not like us at all. It is one of the aspects of American power that people are increasingly focused on, that Europeans maybe don't understand the extent to which it is not European and it is different from us. But it is rooted in many of our ideas. It is rooted in our cultural understanding. And that 19th century story is a weird warping in the sense that, on the one hand, at the end of that story, partly because of the origin tales that underpin it in the national unification account, we Europeans see ourselves, but we maybe miss the ways in which the things that we see in it have been really radically altered by that 19th century experience. And we perhaps miss that. We'll get on to the 20th century in a second, but we perhaps miss the way in which this is not just another version of us.
It's really not in any shape or form. And I think that you can even just reduce that in a way to the geography of it and the sheer size of it. I mean, if you fly over the United States, particularly the further west that you go, I mean, I had to change flights twice earlier this year in Salt Lake City. And when you're flying for the sort of 90 minutes, 2 hours or so coming in, or whichever way you're coming into Salt Lake City, and you realize the size of this city in the desert, it's staggering. I mean, it's just something that you just can't conceive of in Europe. So regardless of what the cultural inheritance is, and I agree with you, I mean, the cultural inheritance is huge in any number of ways. And I think that, we can't underestimate that. Nonetheless, when you transpose that onto that land mass, it's going to come out differently. And, partly pick the Salt Lake City example in Utah for a reason, because then when you take the Christianity, which is coming, and then you put it there, you get Mormonism, you get, a literal retelling of the story of Christianity specifically for this land. And so it's that fusion of something that looks intensely familiar and something that is intensely different that I think that we in Europe still to this day are struggling to get our heads around.
One question about the traditional origin story is one of the distinctive features of this state, which is going to become the dominant global power, its federal nature. Does that, do you think, make it unusual relative to other dominant powers, the most powerful empires that the world has seen? This is perhaps the most powerful of them all, but there have been some pretty powerful ones beforehand. This one has a very distinctive federal character. Again, one of the things I think that Europeans and others miss about the United States is how much of its politics does not happen in Washington, D.C., and how much of what Europeans would think of as the stuff of politics happens at the state level, leaving the federal government to do other things. But clearly, among those other things is the projection of power overseas. And is that split, do you think, in the way American politics is set up, something that, in the way that the United States does project its power overseas, it is not a centralized state. It is not a state in which internal governance maps onto the way it projects power outside. There's a huge disconnect between those two things. American presidents, but also just the American administrative state in all of its different instruments, looks very different inside relative to outside. And there are, within the separation of powers, there are also these extraordinary concentrations of power. Again, do you think that makes it unusual outside of the norm? Maybe even unique?
Yeah, I mean, remember that you like Tocqueville. Tocqueville thought that it was not possible for a European state to be federal precisely because that you couldn't engage in geopolitical defense if you had a federal structure.
Or you could do it in a fake way, like Imperial Germany, but it's Prussia. It's not, you call it a federation, but it's not. But it's not like Virginia or whatever it would be, or New York, or you just think of all the different places that presidents have come from. You can't say there's the dominant place within this federation.
No, and I think that you can also say that the federation causes the United States some quite significant problems when it comes to it being a geopolitical power. I think you can see that quite clearly in the First World War and the whole internal political conflict within the United States about fighting the First World War. So on the eastern seaboard, particularly New York, you have direct engagement with the war from the start because effectively JP Morgan, the New York bank JP Morgan, is acting as a financier to Britain and France from fairly early on in the war. And then you have people in the Midwest and Congress from the Midwest saying that these are the guys, the financiers on the East Coast, who are dragging us in Middle America into this war in the old world in which Americans shouldn't be dying. And it takes, as we know, 3 years for that conflict to work itself out into direct US intervention in the war. And it, after the war is over, remains a kind of rallying call of a part of the United States that was wrong and that was a war for certain commercial interests on the eastern seaboard that harmed this notion of the heartland of America. And then that conflict has a legacy that runs all the way through the interwar years and Roosevelt's problems of taking the United States into the Second World War, which are only in that sense fixed by the Japanese, not only the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but then Hitler actually declaring war on the United States. I think that whole internal political struggle within the United States about being a geopolitical power is absolutely bound up in the geographical division of the United States and the federalism the federalism reflects the geographical differences. I mean, obviously, there's not really a point, I think, in which you can say that some state is really challenging the authority of the federal government over this in the way in which is true in the build-up to the Civil War in the 19th century. It doesn't become that kind of intense constitutional conflict, but the underlying federal politics of it you can see.
And the fact of the Civil War, which in itself is unusual, in the middle of that story, which you could say is the story, the 19th century story, which creates the conditions for American power, there is a civil war. And I don't think there's anything comparable in the history of, of course there are civil wars in Rome and the rest of it, but just the pivot in the middle of that rapid expansion and extension story. So the last thing I want to ask you in this part of the conversation, because we've done pretty well, we haven't mentioned Trump yet, but we are going to, but is that if you then think in this very unusual history, not like the histories of other powers, and Rome, China, Great Britain, Genghis Khan, I mean, they're all unique. So we don't want to overstate the extent to which there's a model and this is the deviation from the model. But at the end of the 19th century, in a way, the conditions are in place for American global power. Many of the conditions are in place, which they absolutely were not at the beginning of the 19th century. So by the 20th century, and certainly in the aftermath of the First World War. But as you've just said, it still feels very politically contingent in lots of ways. All sorts of decisions had to be made, and they presumably could have gone other ways. America didn't just have to quote unquote, embrace its destiny. But it had to overcome some of those internal divisions, and those had to be finessed in all sorts of complicated ways. Roosevelt's genius was partly to play off the different parts of the American polity against each other to create something that he wanted to create. Just how contingent should we think of this 20th century story? So it's not, one temptation is to think the 19th century story is the contingent bit, in the sense that all of these things had to happen in order to get to the point where this continental landmass turned into a state built around a nation-building story could become a global power. And then in the 20th century, it kind of unfolds, almost as if once the conditions were in place, the United States was going to do this. And then you factor oil into the story, you factor globalization of the 20th century kind into the story, including global finance and the rest. But how contingent should we think the 20th century story is to, for instance, different presidents or different configurations in Congress, or indeed different things happening in the way that the 20th century energy story plays out, different foreign policy choices by different American administrations, might have stopped that seemingly inexorable move from 1900 to 2000, from a potentially powerful nation to the most powerful nation state the world has ever seen?
I think this is a hard question, because there is a way of answering it. Well, I'm going to start with that position and maybe come back to it, which is to be quite deterministic about it and say, if you just go above what we've been talking about and think about energy shifts in geopolitics and go back to the beginning of the 20th century and look at what is already becoming, because people have got their eyes on the future, the most important geopolitical energy source of the 20th century, oil, is being produced. It's being produced predominantly in two places, in the United States and Russia. And if you then go to the middle of the 20th century, in the middle third of it in particular, and say, look, the two most powerful states in the world are going to be the United States, and albeit not Russia, it's going to be the Soviet Union. And neither of them that will be true about in the 19th century, particularly obviously the United States. Russia has mattered more. Then you can say, well, look, what's working out is just the logic of energy geopolitics. And obviously for obvious reasons, and I have some sympathy with, probably not least because I probably spent enough time articulating that point about you can read off these things. Obviously in practice, how that happens can't be irrelevant. So then if we just take one of the moments that we've been talking about, which is the First World War, where you can literally see the politics of what US engagement with Eurasia should be playing out with massive stakes. And you look at the final thing, definitive thing that pushed Woodrow Wilson into engaging in the war. It's actually the issue of Germany trying to ally with Mexico and talking about invasion of the southwest of the United States. So it's the threat of a European power in the Western Hemisphere that pushes Wilson. I mean, perhaps he's wanted to for other reasons, but if you look at the sequence of events where he gets to the point, if you like, of no return with his decision making, that is the one. So you can say, well, that's contingent. It's contingent because Wilson tried very hard, actually, to keep, despite the critics of his policy, internal critics, he's tried really quite hard to keep the United States out of this war, and he changes his mind. So that looks like political contingency. But then you step back from that and you can say, well, what were the Germans doing in the middle of World War I, engaging with this seemingly ludicrous idea of invading the United States with the help of Mexico? And part of the answer is obviously that for the European states, not least Germany, that what went on in the Western Hemisphere in terms of resources, including the fact that by this point, the third largest oil producer in the world is Mexico. And then go back to the point about the difficulties that Germany have had in terms of being effectively shut out of the Western Hemisphere where resources are concerned, like the fertilizer problem. You can see that there's an attempt, it goes back, some decades, for the Germans to get some purchase in the Western Hemisphere. And it's not just about oil at all. It's also about having coal stations in the Western Hemisphere. But then I think that gets us back to something that stops being contingent and starts to be a bit structural, which is that once you get into the energy regime in geopolitics of fossil fuels, and you've actually got to move around the world's oceans with an actual fuel, whether that be coal or whether that be oil, when you're not moving around the world's oceans with wind being your energy source. Whoever you are as a geopolitical power, you have to have access to it in the parts of the world where you want your navy to be. So you could argue that the energy shift makes the geopolitics of the oceans global, and that then it becomes quite difficult for the United States to stay out of that. Now, the thing that we've left out of this, which I think is part of the story, is that the United States, in terms of its assertion of its power geopolitically off the shore of Eurasia, not so actually fighting land wars in like Eurasia, it begins somewhere else. It begins in East Asia. It begins in the Pacific. And example one, the taking Philippines as a colony. And all that is happening in the context of the opening up of China, of imperial China, I mean by that. And the fact that the US wants to be a commercial presence in China and doesn't want to get left behind by the European powers and Japan once China has been opened up. And that then in itself involves the United States in this problem of, well, where are you going to have, first of all, coaling stations where you can refuel your navy? I know that's not a very satisfactory answer because I'm moving around between the structural and the contingent and back to the structural again, and I don't entirely know what I think on this point myself. But what I think is it's difficult, I think, in the energy shift aspects of the term, because the United States' rise as a geopolitical power is bound to that energy shift from coal to oil, not to think about what the prior energy shift from wind to coal has done to the nature of geopolitics. And maybe in that world, we wouldn't really imagine that the United States was staying out of things as a geopolitical power and was just going to be content with the continental landmass it had acquired.
And it does have some distant echoes of the 16th century story that you talked about. The Western Hemisphere is not going to be separate from the rest because of these resource questions. But the difference is, what is Germany doing contemplating invading Mexico? What is Hitler doing declaring war on the United States? These things are coming in from the outside. The difference between the 16th century and the 20th century is America is not just equipped to fight back, but America is also playing the same game in other parts of the world. And so the thing that was one directional in that 16th century story, the powers coming in from the outside, is almost by definition now going to go both ways. So the idea that you would get some replication of an earlier isolationist version of this is just implausible. So even if it's not deterministic in a crude sense, it's very hard to imagine whatever the political choices of voters in the electoral college in whichever was the swing state, in whichever were the crucial elections, and then how different presidents use their skills or lack of them to handle Congress, all of that. It's hard to see how the 20th century story doesn't end with massive entanglement.
I think so. I mean, I don't want to be totally determinist about these questions, either in terms of the geopolitical realm being determinist or in terms of energy being determinist within the geopolitical realm. And I think that the moments that look like they're contingent are almost always very interesting. But in this case, I find it hard to see an alternative story of the 20th century in which the United States doesn't become something like the kind of geopolitical power that it does. I mean, it doesn't take some of the oddities of the way that it happens in practice away. And perhaps we need some explanation as to why there's such internal political resistance to it in the 1920s and in the 1930s. But nonetheless, I think some version of it was going to play out.
A reminder that if you would like to hear the second part of my conversation with Glenn Rangwala about the trial and execution and legacy of Saddam Hussein, it's available now on PPF+. Just click on the link in our show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. You will get all of our bonus episodes, ad-free listening, automatic sign-up to our newsletter, and, it should be pointed out, you won't have to listen to me constantly reminding you to sign up. It's got to be worth it just for that. Sign up now. Next time in our regular slot, it's the second part of my conversation with Helen Thompson about the weirdness of American power. You will have noticed we didn't quite get to Donald Trump. Don't worry. Next time, we get there and more. What's so weird about Trump, but also where is American power heading in an age where the confrontation with China is really ramping up? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.